Here you go.
What is this? It looks disgusting.
Well, maybe you could cook for a change.
What'd you say?
I didn't say anything.
No. You said something.
If someone is making you feel unsafe at home, break the cycle of domestic abuse.
What did you say?
Call the Domestic Violence Crisis Line on 1800 800 098 or visit breakthecycle.sa.gov.au to get the confidential help you need. Tap the banner to find out more. A message from the Government of South Australia.
Hi everyone, Steve Davis here. Welcome to episode 310 of the Adelaide Show podcast. What an interesting one we have for you, recorded the far extremes of South Australia. We are talking about primarily SA Police's new Security Response Section, or SRS. You would have seen the video floating around social media and reportage in the news. We're going to see police, our SA Police, walking the streets with military-grade rifles and extra body shielding, etc., and a whole lot of other weapons and communication technology. Not all of them, just a small number of officers who are part of this unit, but it still marks a significant cultural shift for many of us when it comes to thinking about our beloved SA coppers. So we're talking to David Olney, primarily. He's recently of the University of Adelaide, now Senior Analyst at Sage International Australia, which is an Adelaide-based strategic think tank. He helps me unpack my reaction to seeing the video about the SRS and put it in some sort of global context. On that note, we also catch up with a United Nations peacekeeper, Vic Suquet, a former SA police officer, who is very familiar with the sort of weaponry and training and the sort of patrols that the SRS will be undertaking. He's currently based in Afghanistan. He just happened to have been visiting South Australia at the time of recording, so he'll give us some extra perspective on this new development. Also, we drink wine from 8 at the Gate Wines in Rattonbully. We head down to the southeast there, just on the border with SA and Victoria. Thankfully, no Victorians hopped over the border while we were there, so we were a little... no, we weren't. We weren't worried. We knew the police and the army were doing their job, let alone Victorians themselves. And finally, in the musical pilgrimage this week, a new song from Jay Miller, which really wraps up the story, the theme rather, of security and policing. So all of that's coming up in this episode. If you haven't yet, please join our Inner Circle email list. You can just email podcast@theadelaideshow.com.au and ask to be part of it. It means you get a weekly email on a Friday of any week in which an episode's been put out, so you never miss an episode. And I'd love you to be part of our community. It also makes it easy for you to suggest topics and people we should be talking to. If you get a chance to leave a 5-star review for our podcast, that would be greatly appreciated. Also, if you are with someone who's new to podcasting and you think they might be interested in some of these topics, just grab their phone from them with their permission and load a podcast app and search for the Adelaide Show podcast and subscribe them so they don't miss a beat. Finally, these days we have chapter markers in our podcast episodes. So if you're not into wine, you can just hit fast forward and jump straight to the interview, and vice versa. You can work your way through the episode in most podcast players. So there you go. That's it. Enjoy. Just before we get underway with the interview proper for this episode, it's time to do two things. It's to taste the SA drink of the week, but also to toast our late patron, Queen Adelaide. And to do that, I have magically been transported to a paddock in Rattonbully, amid vineyards and sheep at the 8 at the Gate vineyards. And I'm not here illegally, I'm not trespassing. Jane Richards and Claire Davies are both with me. Welcome to the podcast, Jane.
Thank you, Steve.
And Claire.
Thank you, Steve.
So first order of business, would you mind raising your glasses to the Queen?
The Queen.
The Queen.
All right, let's have a little sip. And actually, before I ask some questions, what is it that we're tasting, Jane?
This is our 2015 Cabernet Shiraz. It's a blend of about 50, just over 50% Cabernet and the rest Shiraz.
I just want to say at the moment, because Claire, you're here on the vineyard most of the time. Jane does a lot of the marketing. She comes in and oversees and nurses the winemaking process, dealing with your winemakers and everything. But I just want to pause for a moment because we're recording this at that time of night where the sun's just dipped below the horizon. And so what we have is shadow, dark silhouettes of trees. We have this line of light across the horizon, and that is exactly what I'm getting on my palate with this wine. Let me just explain, dear listener. This enters your palate, and it has all of the dark outlines that we're seeing at the moment in silhouette of the twisted branches and the depth and the character. It's just there. But it's not that bleak. It's not a film noir. We have got these pink streaks of cloud and bright sky, just slithers of it on the palate where there's fruit. That's like majestic angels blasting their trumpets in the distance. This is I've never ever had to describe a wine like this before. Claire, did you expect your 2015 to be such a heaven's chorus when it was finally drunk by me in 2020?
Probably not, to be completely honest. However, in the vineyard, we are able to select probably the best parcels. We can keep that for ourselves. So the Cabernet, I think the wine shows fantastic blackberry characters, and that's evident with the Cabernet, but then the softness comes from the Shiraz because the Shiraz grape is much sort of smoother and rounder.
It's absolutely sumptuous. And you mentioned the sort of best parcels. So you're here, you're chief vigneron, you're tending these vines. Do you, I imagine you probably know some of them by name almost. You're just so intimately involved here every day. So you've got, do you have favourite? I know Eight of the Gate is all about the fact that you two have 8 kids between you and it's been a family enterprise. And I know I'm not going to ask you about favourites among your kids, but among your vines, are there some that are favourites every vintage or does it change?
No, I think it is. Most vintages we do tend to gravitate back to the same areas. So we do, particularly within the vineyard, we get to know it and we get to see it. And the best wines come from the balanced vines. So the less we actually have to do, because the vines are just naturally happy, and the vines produce the intensity of fruit that I think then translate in the final product.
That's very similar to picking your favourite children too. It tends to be those who are resilient and look after.
Yes, self-reliance is important.
And Jane, of course, you've got the marketing eye. You're involved. You're stretching your vision all around the world, but you're not the only person who knows the value of these crops. There are other big name brands that come and you supply, isn't there?
Yeah, we sell a lot of fruit to other wine companies like Penfolds and Taylor's and a few local wine companies, and it changes from year to year as well.
And what's interesting to me is Rattenbully, I kind of knew it existed, but Peter Gago, who's the winemaker for Treasury Wine Estates, which oversees Penfolds, etc., you shared a little clip of a quote that he'd said a while ago that he loves this place.
Yeah, he speaks really highly of Rattenbully, and particularly from 2014 on, you can see Rattenbully listed in some of their icon wines as the first region, which means it's got the most fruit in the label. So it's probably no coincidence that this wine is a very similar blend to Bin 389, but a lot cheaper.
Now, tell me, talking of that, we normally just taste the wine and that's it. But just before we finish, I happen to know that you wouldn't mind if the Adelaide Show podcast listeners went to your website to buy some. The retail price on this per bottle is
$28.
And is there a code you think that Adelaide Show listeners could use if they went to your... Because I've got to say, both myself and Michael Shanahan, who I work with in my other job, talked about marketing, we both bought some wine from Jane of this, and we're both snobs. And, God, we loved it. We've actually bought more. So I want to share this secret with everyone. If you go to 8atthegate.com.au, what's the code that our listeners could put in to get a little bit off?
If they just sign up to the marketing list, which pops up as soon as they enter their website, then I'll send them the code.
Oh, I like the way you work. I love the cut of your jib. I can see why you're... look, seriously, this is an absolute steal. Even at $28, it is magnificent. But if we're going to get a little bit off...
Yeah, you'll get 25% off. So
25%. Okay. All that's left for me to say is the 2015 8 at the Gate Cabernet Shiraz is the South Australian drink of the week.
G'day, my name's Cozzy from Channel 9 South Aussie with Cozzy. Actually, I met Steve a while ago. In fact, I first saw him on Crime Stoppers on Channel 9, and nowadays he's hosting this podcast. So he's gone on to bigger and better things, which I'm really proud of.
South Aussie with Cozzy.
In the words of Commissioner of Police Grant Stevens, successful policing requires the support and goodwill of the public as much as it does the dedication and effort of each police officer and employee. With the announcement of SAPOL's new security response section, which features police officers armed with automatic machine guns and extra body armour and technology, the community discussion has frequently brought up sentiments shared by these two commenters from the Facebook wall where the SAPOL announcement was. One from Sam Powery, who said, "I'm not at all convinced about the need for this or its stated value, and I'm not aware that there was any sort of public consultation or fielding of the idea, given the enormous impact it will have, mostly deleterious, it seems, on the public's view of and relationship with SAPOL. I believe it to be a very poorly judged move from which it will be very difficult to step back from." And Isabel Keane made this comment in response to the SAPOL video announcing SRS, saying, "Hey, we should still go up to these militia police and say hi." And she said, "I'm not approaching a cop with a rifle in Elizabeth to ask why they have them." And so, as preface to this part of the podcast, my personal fear is that this move threatens SAPOL's long-held ability to maintain the support and goodwill of the public. To me, the SRS is a far cry from the community policing narrative that many of us grew up on and upon which SA has prided itself. However, as I've said everywhere, I'm always open to change my position when I learn more. So I've turned to David Olney, recently of the University of Adelaide, now Senior Analyst at Sage International Australia, which is an Adelaide-based strategic think tank, because he'll be able to put this move into perspective in various ways. David, welcome back to the Adelaide Show.
Thank you, Steve. Once again, a pleasure to be here.
And might I also point out that you can hear David on his own podcast, Blind Insights with David Olney. Highly, highly recommended. And I'm just saying for the record, David, that I got the plug-in for your podcast before you did.
Hey, you always do that. It's a very kind thing you do.
Now, David, one last thing before we start our interview proper. I just want to say for the record to people listening, I'm not here as a lefty, as far as I know it, or a snowflake, or any other type of type. I'm actually here as a passionate South Aussie. I care for my community. I've always had utmost respect for our police. I'm also someone who holds opinions in a way that's always open to change when I discover new evidence. At least that's the standard I hold myself to. I'm completely disappointed we couldn't get officials to join this community interview tonight. I did ask police media and also the police minister to join us, and they declined the offer because I really wanted to hear their responses to my earnest questions here in an atmosphere of trust. That's not going to happen. Instead, David and I will unravel the many strands of this story, and David, I'm going to have one last thing before we start. It's almost me replacing you as the lecturer tonight and setting up the outset of a presentation. But here we are. These are the things I'd love to cover. Is there such a thing as universal expectations of policing that's held by communities? And that'll be different in different parts of the world, I'm sure, and even different parts within a society. The significance of upping the lethal weaponry being carried by our police, the efficacy of having high-profile militarily armed police in regard to terrorism and violent events, or whether that's just what's called security theatre, how you wield the sledgehammer of military weapons when dealing with peaceful but protesting citizens, and the holes in our ability to hold public discourse on contentious issues in a civil way. They're the things I hope we cover. Are you feeling confident that we can?
As long as we've got at least 5 hours, we'll be fine.
That's all we can ask for. All right, here we go. I should also mention Jill Hicks was asked to be on the show. She couldn't make it tonight because it's now the 15th anniversary today of the London bombings in 2005, in which, sadly, she was terribly injured and lost both her legs. So she's doing a lot of speaking engagements, including one with my ABC colleague Peter Gers. I will have words with him for robbing the Adelaide show of her
Stealing
voice.
her from you.
Exactly.
Or from us, I should say.
Yes. So let's begin at the beginning. I made a comment about the community policing narrative that I've grown up with, David, here in South Australia. And that is what was shaken when I saw the video announcing this new SRS force. Does that make sense to you that I could have been, scared internally by that video?
Yes, it does. But I think there's a few things we need to put in order with this. Mm-hmm. First and foremost, keep in mind the amount of footage that's been, available lately of the protests and riots in the United States, where paramilitary policing has hit a whole new level of too much equipment and not enough training. So we've been seeing imagery of legitimate protests and police officers taking sort of aggressive policing to a whole new level. And the real risk is that our brain jumps to what we've most recently seen. So I think probably what people are struggling with at the moment is two things. If they've got a memory of community policing from pre-9/11, and they then combine that with what they've seen in relation to Black Lives Matter in the United States, there's just an absolute culture shock in the two different images. But there's been so much change since 9/11, and a lot of that's been gradual, so it doesn't necessarily stick. And there have also been moments where community policing hasn't worked and we've needed other things, and as a consequence, things have been more difficult than they should have been. So, for example, the Lindt siege made us realise we were going to have to deal with terrorism on Australian shores. Mm-hmm. The guy who took the car in Melbourne and drove through the crowd is an example of where Victoria Police were very clearly seen to, on the day, not have the equipment or the training to resolve a problem quickly. So there's lots of little events starting with 9/11 and rolling through. And if we look at things like, the truck that was used in Marseille to run people down, the van that was used in Barcelona, this is a response to so many things that have happened worldwide. The London Bridge attack, the attacks in the markets in London. Now, by the time the attacks happened in the markets in London, and I can't remember the date, which is annoying, but you literally, by that point, the Brits are able to send in police like what we're about to get, SRS, who can immediately take shots from range, eliminate dangers to the public as efficiently and as quickly as possibly, and in real terms, potentially that day saved 100 lives.
I take the point about the culture shock, and I think that's what I'm going through at the moment in adjusting to this, is the culture shock of seeing my beloved SAPOL officers now fully decked out, well, at least this group, fully decked out in military gear. And I have noticed uniforms changing over time away from the pants and shirt to more army fatigues, canvas, pockets all over the place.
Yeah, cargo pants, assault boots, load-bearing vests, baseball caps. So this is another consequence of the post 9/11 world. Because the Americans went through such a paranoid security moment, and so much equipment comes from there, and there's always a budget constraint. So if you want the best price on uniform, you buy the standard paramilitary uniform in the shade of blue as close as possible to what your police force used to wear. So you see this transition all over the world. So as much as each time we have a state election, there will be a debate about, do we need more police on the beat? Yeah, it's always a debate about how many people, not what it costs to kit them out. So if we're going to have more people, the inevitable consequence is we try and save money on equipment. And one of the ways to do that is to go towards the standardized paramilitary uniform that is cheaper rather than continuing to do something more traditional.
It's still taking a bit to process, but...
yeah, you just keep processing and asking questions, and I'll try not to lead this. I'll just try and give you answers to things you want to know, because there's so many bits that contribute to this.
Okay, how much of a filtered vacuum have I lived in to start this program by saying, I've always loved and respected our police. I'm sure there are people living within South Australia who have very different situations. So there's going to be, if you like, a kaleidoscope of emotional reactions that people are going to have right across the spectrum. Would that be fair?
I think absolutely that's the case. And I think the really big issue here, and the issue that starts all of the issues, is I don't remember any overt public debate about this. And there was no media strategy to explain this from the political perspective. And that's where it should have come from. The officers who put their hands up to serve in this unit are the same lovely officers that were doing community policing a month ago, 2 months ago, 6 months ago, whenever they had to decide to put their hand up for the additional selection, the additional training to take on this more difficult role. It's not their job to explain themselves to us. It is the premiers, cabinets, and police ministers' job to explain all of this to us to our satisfaction, and preferably before the decision has been made to do this.
And that I don't recall that, but we also have a pretty fractured media at the moment. I mean, how robustly fair and well thought out would that public debate have been? It would have been, I would imagine, just blown out into a tabloid discussion within 2 seconds.
Well, I think it would have been a case of unpacking the same things I unpacked.
Okay.
Let's go over the events where conventional police officers were not be able to respond in the way they wanted to for lack of equipment and training. And I think that's a really important thing. So a very important thing happened in Australian policing after the Lindt siege. Traditionally, South Australian, well, all Australian police really, have been trained that if there's a really intense situation, contain it. Contain it, draw back, put some space around it, get the public out of the way, and then bring in your specialists. So in South Australia's case, this would be Star Group. Traditionally, conventional police officers would have gone, this is bad, get the public back, lock it down if they could. They would have avoided confronting someone if they could, and waited the minutes or half hour or whatever for Star Group to get there and take over, because everything they train for is those more intense, potentially more violent siege type situations. After the Lindt siege happened, most Australian police forces had to have an additional bit of training called direct action training. And that was essentially turning most of their training on their head. And it was, if you genuinely believe the public are in imminent danger, you can't try and contain this. You need to go weapon up and remove the perpetrator. And all serving officers had to be put through that. And the ones I've spoken to, a large number went, I'll do this because I want to protect the public. But I am really not comfortable of stepping beyond the role I've had for a decade or 2 decades to be that aggressive in the way they're policing. Like if their lives are in danger or someone from the public is immediately in danger, fine, that's what they've been trained for. But they've not been trained to go, this could get much worse. I have to decide now to escalate this. So in a sense, creating a unit like this is a way to say, in a big situation like Rundle Mall or a sporting event, conventional police won't have to go beyond containment because SRS is there, and SRS have chosen to take on that additional pressure of direct action, which thankfully comes with a significant amount of extra training. To put it in context, the average police officer is competent with a handgun. I don't want an officer who's competent with a handgun having to take, a shot in a crowd with hundreds of people when they're only competent. I want someone who is highly competent taking a shot with, a longer barreled rifle so they can take the accurate shot and end the situation more than likely without killing anyone.
We just lost some of that last part of your answer. It just dropped.
Where do you want me to go back to?
You just take it up on you want a highly competent officer taking a shot.
Rather than having a competent officer taking a shot that I'm not convinced they have sufficient training to take and get right and feel confident with, I would much rather a highly competent police officer who has extra training, is using a long-barreled firearm, has probably got a better sighting device, and has got the confidence to want to take this job on, do the extra training, has done well in the extra training, and who can take the shot accurately and cope with taking the shot accurately.
All right, I'm about to push this boat out from shore away from just that culture shock of seeing our coppers with much more lethal weaponry. But before I do, the significance of this lethal weaponry, you touched on it in your answer before, David. I would have no qualms in sidling up to some of our current officers on the beat saying, "G'day." I often do. If I've got my girls with me, I get them to say hello. That is not the thing when suddenly you don't have this rather nice German Shepherd. It's turned into a Doberman Pinscher, or at least the potential to change into one on an instinct. That is a bit of existential uncertainty that it comes into the equation. Is that strikes me on one hand of being unhealthy for that community spirit. On the other hand, is it just a necessary evil?
This is what we should have had a debate about and more time to get used to.
Right.
So, in a large chunk of Europe, police like we're seeing with SRS are normal, and they're called gendarmeries. The French have a gendarmerie. I think the Spanish, the Italians, the Dutch all have gendarmeries. And it's because they have a history of needing to deal with higher levels of violence, more intense situations. So I've had a friend in Paris pushing her pram with her little kids, needing to get up on a curb, the curb's high, and suddenly up, jogging has come two French gendarmes in body armour with assault rifles to help her pick the pram up and get it onto the footpath, smiling. And she sort of rang me and went, "I've just had the weirdest experience."
Yep.
But like she said, she laughed after and went, they were smiling as they jogged up, got the kids organised, got the pram organised, make sure she knew where she was going, and then just went back to doing their rounds. Now, after the things that have happened in Paris in the last 5 years, the Parisians are so used to gendarmes historically, and the amount of time they spend patrolling has got even more post the major attacks in Paris. So for us, it's the shock of there was nothing, and then we have SRS. And I think that is a real failure of messaging. The fact that in the little police video, they make the point, come up and say hello. We need to be doing this. These SRS officers don't want to be distant. They're going to be working in crowds. They're going to be moving around the mall every day. They're going to be moving around the train station every day. They don't want people making space around them and feeling intimidated. That's not what they signed up to be police officers for. But it's going to take time. And I guess they are going to be working very hard to smile at people. And I think this is really where it's important that we didn't ask Star Group officers to come back from their more intense role again of being the ones who kick in doors and go and weapon up for sieges, and come back to this level of community policing with the potential to escalate. It was much better to train people to this level whose normal duty day was community type policing.
Yep, I mean, I hear you. It still seems, and I think this is the communication error in the way it was delivered.
Huge.
Because it seemed disingenuous to say, here we are, they've just spent most of the video explaining all the lethal weaponry, but, come up and say g'day. It just didn't sit genuinely.
No, and that's the shock of this. And, things were the wrong way around in the whole, way this was introduced. But I suppose the question that should have been out there and been part of this debate is, okay, we've seen things like happened in Melbourne. We've seen the Lindt siege. Most analysts would say that during lockdown for COVID-19, recruiting of lone wolves has probably gone up because more people are at home in front of their computer and looking just for things to do. IS, Islamic State, have been saying that COVID-19 is God's little helper. So we have to assume that things aren't going to be better in terms of lone wolf terrorism post-COVID-19. If anything, if the example of IS returning in Iraq or Syria to be more dangerous, things will probably be worse after this.
And that brings us to the efficacy of having this high-profile, militarily armed police unit to be out and about to hopefully respond to terrorism and violent events. I've heard it referred to, though, as security theatre for a number of reasons. And one of them that just struck me, and I think it harkens back to an early chat we had a long time ago. If I was planning one of these events, I would just, if I've got someone in my group, be a mother pretending her pram won't go up on the pavement to, bang, do a surprise attack. If I was going to be serious, I'd look for these highly visible militarised police and take them out first. And as you mentioned, I think a long time ago in one of our chats, you just move the theatre of war to where you can cause more terror and be away from the initial response. That's what I'm wrestling with. That's the other side of the coin. For me, it was the culture shock. And secondly, it's really, how is this going to be effective as a deterrent against people who are fully committed?
Well, this is sort of the bizarre thing. You and I, as rational people who don't want to do harm, move on to less secure targets. But if we look at where the guy drove the car in Melbourne, if we look at where the Lindt siege was, if we look at the attacks in London, if we look at the attacks in Paris, the terrorists went for the most spectacular option possible because they don't care if they die. So they want the maximum number of CCTV cameras. They want the maximum number of cell phones covering everything from the first moment. They want the biggest amount of coverage and to create as much mayhem in a location that will instill the greatest amount of fear. So whereas you and I might want the biggest bang, they want the most coverage for the bang. And it's a weird thing about the psychology of terrorism. It's not to say terrorists are insane, but the logic is the size of the spectacle, demonstrating that in the most secure place, they can still wreak havoc. To them, that is the way to instill genuine fear. Now, whether I would agree with that if I was plotting and planning to be a dastardly dude is a whole other thing. But I don't think like a terrorist. I think like the person who ideally, hopes we can stop them being radicalized in the first place. But that has not worked since 9/11. And there's no evidence we're going to get better at, stopping radicalisation anytime soon.
Well, I want to feed in a couple of comments that have to come in anonymously. They're from someone who works in a very closely related field, who just, for obvious reasons, can't go on the record, but shared some thoughts. One of them is they haven't been able to find empirical evidence that heavily armed police have actually stopped terrorist attacks. They point to London in 2005, Manchester, France, all since 9/11, where police have had.
The only example where it's had any useful impact, as far as I could work out, was the attack on the market in London where fairly elite police officers and quite possibly the British SAS were there within minutes. That's the one case where you can say most definitely there was a difference.
And so
it's one out of several at best.
Yep. And then this person argued, would money be better spent on intel and programs to divert youth away from radicalisation?
Okay, well, the de-radicalisation thing, again, inside the security box, there may be better evidence on de-radicalisation than I'm aware of on the outside of the security box. But I am totally unconvinced that de-radicalisation is having any significant impact. So to me, all those things are legitimate, but the big question is, have political leaders used fear to shape their response since 9/11? And I would argue yes. And does this continue the idea of using fear? We're all afraid these people are going to protect us. Also, too, it's confusing us with the Americans. The Americans do seem to take some weird level of comfort in highly armed police officers in body armour. So some cultures seem to be able to normalise this. It suits their hyper-macho, weird mindset. We're not one of those countries. And I think this is the reason why it's another reason why a new unit was created here, rather than letting the Star Group out in the street. Because if you put the Star Group out in the street, they even look more aggressive.
That's true. They're the super pit bull terriers.
Well, they are for when it's so bad you need to do something about it now, which means, very, well-organised application of violence if nothing else works.
And I want to give credit where it's due. The police are there to go in front of clear and present danger, and protect us, and go in and do that hard yards. They put their lives on the line, and it takes a certain gravelly substance of grit to sign up for something like that and then see it through.
And historically, they haven't. Historically, police have been terrible shots until about the 1990s.
Right.
Because the average police officer... Okay, again, history of humans doing violence on violence. The classic book on this is Dave Grossman's book On Killing. Basically, up until the end of World War II, the best accuracy we'd seen in any war was 20% accuracy.
Wow.
Because humans don't want to kill humans. Now, that's soldiers who've been trained to shoot other soldiers, who've been given permission to kill other soldiers on the other side. It's estimated that probably in the late 80s, the average police officer was still at best at 20%. So their training changed radically to get them used to the idea of being able to take the accurate shot. But they don't get the months and months and months of training per year to do this. It is not central to their job. It will be the worst day of their career. And most police officers will go an entire career without firing a shot in anger, which means, on the worst day of your life, you do what you've trained to do. You don't suddenly step up a level. So this is why training people to the higher level to cope with the worst days of their life is so critical. If we trained all police officers to the level of accurately taking a difficult shot on the worst day of their life, the budget would be impossible. The vast majority of police officers probably would not want to be trained to that level, and the level of psychological damage to them would probably go up even more, and the way they would function in society as a whole would make it even more difficult for us to deal with them as an organisation.
Wow. That's an interesting thought. And I think what I like about that insight, David, and that's why I appreciate having you on, is you're revealing the levels of nuance in this discussion. It's not just black and white.
No, it's everything else. And that's where the communication's so important. But really, historically, police services, and again, we need to call them police services now, they deliberately got rid of force in their name because they didn't want to be seen as the other that's using intimidation. So it says for so many people who join the police service to serve, taking on the role of having to wear body armour and a helmet and carry a rifle is, well, do we really have to? It's not an easy decision. And this is why this is not a big unit. Because in reality, most people wouldn't want it.
I think I heard about 48 officers or something of that.
That's the number I've heard is 48. I'm not sure if that's a final number. In reality, it's probably all we could ever justify, but also it's all we should ask of a service where this was not the norm. If you really wanted to specialise in being the people who dealt potentially with the most difficult situations, the greatest risk of violence, and the greatest risk of having to use violence, you did selection for Star Group and you spent your career in that alternate space of living on the edge of that intensity all the time. But that's not community policing. And in a sense, I'm glad we have an expanded Star Group, because in the main, they're either not being used or doing really extreme stuff.
Yeah.
The real advantage to me with SRS, like the European gendarme model, is if we can get used to treating them like police officers, not what we would call in special forces terms assaulters or operators. If we can still see them as police officers, they'll remember that's the principal part of their job. So it's really important as a society that we remember that when all these officers joined SAPOL, there was no such thing as SRS.
You mentioned community policing in that last passage of conversation, and I should have shared this at the beginning. This is Jill Hicks' comment that she sent through a day before our recording. She said, in reflection upon the SRS, she said, my thoughts have turned to the London that I knew not so long ago, where two police constantly strolled their hood and said hello and knew the community. I lived in King's Cross and always felt safe. I think at a time when people are suffering from the threat of an untreatable deadly virus, of great uncertainty in life, work, finances, the last thing the public psyche needs is an added heavy addition. It's not how we live, especially in Australia, SA. We've proven to be very prepared to physically distance and do the right things.
Yeah, this is the problem of all these things coming together and being conflated. But I would make the point about when Jill lived in London. There were always elite police officers in fast cars, ready to engage if necessary because of the history of the IRA. Unofficially, there's always been elite special forces soldiers available to help them. But you didn't see it. You still had community policing plus this extra level. In a sense, part of what's difficult for us now is we've already seen the transition of our community police looking paramilitary. So already the semi-paramilitary uniform has now been taken the extra level of going to body armour and a helmet.
Yeah.
So we've just seen what looks like a consistent acceleration. I have to rely on your eyes here as the sighted one in this conversation, but I'm assuming that London police are still wearing their very traditional uniform in the main, that community policing still looks like community policing.
I would hope. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe go have a peek at some point, but that would be something worth checking. So some places have not gone away from community policing looking like community policing. But this is something, how would you have explained to the population, by the way, we promised you another 15 police officers doing this, this and this. But in order to do that, we need to cut the cost on uniform and other stuff. The best way to do that is make them look paramilitary. What would you like, the extra police and the old uniforms and a bigger bill? So part of this is we don't really have a debate where we are given the full explanation of what it costs to do things. We just give them promises by politicians who I think really just want to tick the complicated box called policing at the most rudimentary level and then move away for what should be a constant debate, if they were serious, about how society and policing relate.
Yeah. I have just had a look, by the way, at images of London Police 2020, and it seems they've got just typical dark trousers. They might or might not be that sort of pocket. They don't seem to have pockets on them, just heavy pants, white shirts. They've got their blue vests, which I imagine are bulletproof or protective vests, and they've got the bobby's hat or the some of the female officers.
So at least they've kept the traditional helmet and they've kept the white shirt.
Yes,
so
exactly.
Even if it's been modified a bit, we've maintained a couple of key things that keep the sense of community policing a bit more obvious.
Yeah.
Whereas if we look at America, even historically, the sheriff would have a huge revolver.
Yes.
low slung on a thigh to make for a fast draw. They looked like a gunslinger even before they could look paramilitary. So in some cultures, like I said, there's an odd thing about the Americans of somehow they can make peace with this aggressive macho look to policing, immaterial of the fact it makes people afraid. They've got massive problems, far bigger than the problems we'll ever have, hopefully, and yet they still do it.
And there's a price that's paid for that comfort. You look at the number of people who were killed at the hands of police, including an Australian woman who had called the police to report on an incident, and so I think that informs some of the culture shock that some of us have gone through. Mind you, I've got to say, the South Australian government would have done well to consult with you to think through the communication strategy and the whole approach to this, because you are making it sound much more like a plausible and responsible act in the spirit of what I've known as SA Police all my life.
Let's call it plausible, but whether it's responsible, even I'm not sure how far we should go, because I'm one person.
Yeah, sure.
I can make that point that, yes, when the London market was attacked, specialist police officers made all the difference in the world. In most other situations, they don't appear to have made a major difference. But we don't know if there's been times where they've been able to intervene beforehand around the world, and because of ongoing investigations, we just don't know.
Yeah.
Certainly there's situations where knowing that someone more competent who's been willing to have the extra training can do something to end a situation very quickly is preferable to someone being out of their depth and beyond their training. But we're preparing for the 1 in a million. The problem is the 1 in a millions now happen. So it's how responsible are we to prepare for 1 in a millions? I lean like you towards, I wish we didn't have to, but because of what I do for a job, thinking about this stuff, I come down on you probably have to do these things, but how you prepare them, how you prepare the community is so critical. And this is really where it would be interesting to know which state government, prepared this. How long did this take? How long did it take for SAPOL to decide what the unit would be like, to prepare the training package? This is all stuff. Now, we don't need to know the specifics of the training package, because that would be giving away to a potential shooter who might have a go at SRS what they know how to do. But an additional 6 weeks of training, well, a lot of training can be packed in 6 weeks. How was it devised? Who contributed? To what extent did we rely on existing training that perhaps International Deployment Group use within the AFP or other specialist police units across Australia use? Is this a thing that the cost is being shared across all states? Because the skill set is similar and similar units are going to appear everywhere. There was just such a lack of messaging.
Yeah. And they haven't given anything away about the training in the video. Just you wouldn't have obviously seen it, in inverted commas. But there was one shot of a woman from this unit running up to a little stick that was held off the ground about, 40 centimetres high, and she was able to step over that stick and keep running with her gun.
Yeah, the lady who is screaming, "Drop the knife." I'm assuming that's the bit of audio that you're talking about the visuals from.
That's another bit, a little bit later on.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And so see, that also doesn't help the fact that the training looked Keystone Cop-ish. It looked very unimpressive, coupled with the shock of seeing our beloved officers armed to the teeth. And I will concede, my faith in the system is such that I think there would have been much more depth going on behind the scenes, and they can't share and divulge stuff for security reasons. It's just unfortunate it was shared at all, because it just sets up a dissonance.
Yeah, it was bad imaging. It's imaging for people for whom thinking about this stuff is normal. It's not imaging to help people make this normal in a positive way. There should have been a debate first and a discussion of, well, this seems an important thing to do, but how do we move towards it? How do we accustom the computer? So the fact that they now have a rifle, well, what rifle? Is it semi-automatic? Is it fully automatic? What kind of sighting system is it using to give them a greater advantage in a crowd to take a necessary shot? Those kind of technical details, though you probably don't want to share all of them, perhaps indicate this is not as extreme as it could be.
One last stop before I want to just turn our attention to public discourse and maybe get a few primer points on how to make a better go of it. And that is the last thought that went through my mind upon seeing the SRS videos is they're patrolling Rundle Mall, and there's a bit of unhappiness that develops. You're in a civilian area where citizens, can express, they can protest from time to time. They can have all sorts of mental health outbursts, and suddenly, instead of having a pistol, we now have very lethal weaponry. And I know you're saying these people are going to be much better trained, but the potential for collateral damage in crowded civilian areas has got to be higher.
This is something that should have been very well explained. If we're in a crowded area and we've got the normal level of patrolling of community police officers and SRS, who's first to intervene if it just looks like a normal event? What I want to know is that more often than not, it's not going to be that you take conventional officers out of an environment. You add SRS in on top. And that as much as possible, it's the conventional officers that lead because they don't have to be worried about stowing a rifle. Right. They don't have to be worried about their gear getting in the way and making it more difficult. So part of this is, how is this going to work? And that's another unsatisfactory thing, because we don't need the specific tactics of that, but we need to understand, does this mean they've diminished the number of community police officers in Rundle Mall? Or will there just be a couple of teams of SRS around as well? A total lack of information that we've been provided by the people who should have provided it, which is the Premier, the Cabinet and the Police Minister.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we might get a chance to revisit this later with some different angles on this conversation, and the invitation will be open for them to join us, because this is a conversation on the public record. In closing, David, I'd like to just reflect on public discourse. I have long had a personal rule that I never put anything of substance into Facebook, for example, these days, because it's easy for people to go past and take pot shots filled with cynicism and without any responsibility for their comments, just to cause angst. Other people respond. It just devolves into a pointless exercise of disingenuous gainsaying, where people just back into their corners, pull on their stripes, and it is completely frustrating. The sort of behaviour that you would hope wouldn't happen if we were sat down together face to face like we are now and having this sort of conversation. I'd love to draw from you, if you don't mind, some thinking about how to hold ourselves and help do our bit to raise the level of community debate, because on contentious issues like these, let alone any others, we would all benefit greatly from being able to share with a degree of vulnerability and charity and listen to others and possibly even shift our positions. And David, just before, I know you've got so much to say, but I'm just wondering, you tell me how you'd like to go forward in this. I'm sure you've got some general things you'd like to say, but I've also got an example of text from the Facebook commentary around the SRS announcement, which does kick up the dust on a few elements of the sort of conversation pieces that I see online, and we could dismantle that piece by piece and reflect on it.
Let's start with that. That seems a good place to start, because there are so many angles we can take on this. I suppose the only thing I'd want to say is, civility seems to depend on, your identity is clear. If you're hiding, if you're anonymous, behaviour gets worse. So part of the big problem with social media is people are not necessarily making it clear who they are. And it seems they then just take a free pass on being awful. So, in a sense, civility seems to go with being willing to represent your identity honestly, would be my starting point, I think.
Yeah, and in fact, I had noticed that a number of the people who seem to just be drive-by commenters who just whip up frenzy have no photos in their profile and maybe one friend connected. So you would think it's a profile made.
Yeah, it's deliberate trolling.
Yeah. Okay, so here's a comment by Peter Ross Love, and it's in all the conversation underneath the SRS announcement by the police, and it said this: all the keyboard warrior experts on use of force, I bet they also would be happy if Qantas staff did no maintenance on planes until there was a crash to identify a fault. So I'll just pause there because there's two bits here. There's, I think it's called an ad hominem attack by saying all the keyboard warrior experts. So you're basically belittling the other people for who they are, and then coming up with an analogy of comparing military-grade armed police patrolling being the same as Qantas doing maintenance. What are your thoughts on those two aspects?
Well, it's just deliberately obnoxious, or trash, basically. It's people saying stuff just to vent, and it's almost like they don't even care what the issue is. They just want to vent, and there's this place where you can vent without consequences. And if you vent in a particularly nasty way, people will respond, which in a sense gives you the sense that your vent caused a ripple in the universe. And do we really want people's poor behaviour to cause ripples in the universe?
And do you think that's a good analogy? Military-grade police patrolling versus Qantas doing maintenance? Does that hold?
Well, it's a terribly stupid comparison.
Okay. He continues, and this is where I see people just throw on the Guernsey of their side. I, for one, am happy to have better police and equipment any day to deter incidents and criminal behaviour and violent offenders. All the commenters will be crying blue murder if their family was attacked by armed extremists like in London. It'll be too late asking for better equipped police when that happens, which for sure one day they will. And yet, as Jill Hicks would concede, even with those crack squads around London in 2005, didn't protect her from a bus being blown up.
No, but again, the key thing to me in that is deterrence. If we can learn a lesson from the post-9/11 world, it is that deterrence for particularly lone wolf terrorists hasn't worked. So this is why units like this do come into being, because deterrence hasn't worked. So we have not been able to remove the threat of radicalisation and lone wolf terrorists from our societies.
And so, but this is being forwarded as a tool of deterrence.
Yeah, which is, again, the messaging. Really, if our political leaders believe this stuff causes deterrence, they're not paying attention to their briefings. So once again, this is never a policing problem. It's a political problem. Because police are people who decide to do a difficult job for the well-being of all of us. Or at least that's what they should be if things are running well. Now, at times it doesn't run well, and there's times where people end up in the job who shouldn't be, but that's the same with everything. That is, though, the exception. That's the minority. But it is always a political question as to why we fund, train, and manage policing. So if the police believe this stuff deters anyone, if the political leaders believe this deters anyone from doing anything, where have they been?
So that shouldn't be part of the messaging. There's other effective elements of the messaging that would... Yeah, okay.
This is about being responsive to things we can't deter.
Yes. Two last points in this piece before we then just have a general conversation to finish off on approaching these debates. He then says, saying it has never happened so far does not mean it will not. Now, this backs the rest of us into a corner of trying to argue for a negative or prove a negative, which is pretty impossible, I would have thought. Is that just...
Yeah, it's a good tool of rhetoric. Yeah, right. He's making sure it's very hard to argue with him. But again, what does the media do every day?
Yes. His last bit, maybe now there is more deterrent. Now just disband the SAPOL band and put that money into better operational police training and more equipment and ammo to keep up weapons skills. So more equipment and ammo. That'll do it.
Now, I'm assuming that's meant to be like an ironic sentence, but we don't have an emoji to get the irony? Or is he being serious?
I think he's serious, actually. I got the impression from this that he diminishes the value of the SAPOL band, which to me goes right to the first comments.
Yes. So we basically start on the same weird level and end on the same weird level of, really, what are you trying to do other than to vent and cause a ripple in the universe?
Right. So, David, I didn't. All I did was copy that for our conversation today. I would be reticent to engage this person in any conversation because I'm not feeling like they are there with skin in the game for an earnest conversation. So, give me some prima tips if you wouldn't mind, because you've been involved in argument and critical thinking at a beautiful level for a long time, and I'm sitting down cross-legged in front of you, ready to learn.
See, this is where the problem is. This is one of those things where after everything I've learned, I still don't have very many good answers.
Oh, okay.
Because the core of this at the end of the day is you can only reason with reasonable people.
Right.
And you can only choose to put evidence to the best of your ability in front of people. You can't change their mind. The most powerful form of argument I've ever found in all my years of training and of training people is not to try and change someone's mind, but to put in front of them evidence that should at least make them stop and think. And if they engage with it, should open the door that maybe they perceive the situation differently. And more often than not, with people who are reasonable, it has exactly that role. But with people who are unreasonable, I don't even know where you start. And it seems to me the more stressed we all become because of COVID, the more stressed we became after 9/11 because of terrorism. There are people now who are just constantly in a high stress, don't listen state. And, part of going back to what we were talking about right at the beginning, that we both remember what seemed at the time like a gentle form of community policing. And yet, I think part two of the society then, it was a society that wasn't as wound up. Because I would assume that a wound up society then requires police to wind up in response to deal with it. So I have a terrible feeling that reducing stress, making people show their real identity, putting evidence in front of them but not trying to change their mind, just give them enough data to try and go, well, look, here's what we have on the topic. How does that fit with your argument? Don't even challenge their argument. Ask them how it fits with their argument. And if they go, well, I don't trust your evidence, go, well, where's your evidence? Let's have some evidence for your perspective. So almost in the sense of journalism, how do you validate what they're talking about? Can they validate what they're talking about? Well, if they can't validate what they're talking about, then you can legitimately go, well, how can I engage with you when there's no evidence to talk about?
And that's my fear, is there's no compulsion to engage, because I even sat around a table here with a mum from a kid at school and talking about different things. It might have been vaccination, might have been something else about responses to COVID-19. And her position was, oh, so you're trying to take a scientific evidence approach. Scientists are all sold out. They're paid for by people. The press, they're just a lapdog to the government, and the government's got its own agenda. Now, that has kicked out the store from underneath 3 institutions
that are critical to the world functioning of society.
And there's nothing you can do at that point.
No. Look, negativity bias is a biological problem for humans. The human who was suspicious, the human who didn't believe something new, the human who didn't take risks, historically had kids. As a consequence of that, negativity is more normal than openness to change and difference. So there's a wonderful book by Britt Andreatta called Wired to Resist. So there's fundamentally 4 bits of the brain that are all permanently scanning for, are we at risk? If so, I am doing nothing new and I am withdrawing from anything that I pose as a challenge or a threat. And I think we are at a point of human history where so much of life for so many people is potentially lighting up those 4 parts of their brain on a daily basis that reasoning with people is becoming progressively more difficult. I got into podcasting because I wanted to talk to more people, and my students missed listening to me when they finished uni, when they finished training with me in a corporate setting or a military setting or whatever other setting. But what I hope is that in the silence of people's homes, things like podcasts give people a chance to ratchet down that stress and negative response and perhaps listen with a more open, less judgmental, less aggressive mind. Because out in public, I'm not really sure what we do to get that better behavior. Certainly, we're trying, it seems, to teach it in schools and universities to listen to everyone. But that is entirely dependent on how much time and effort can be put in. And what happens in the classroom has to be reflected in other places. So if, home is very much a listen and learn, schools listen and learn, maybe there can be a win. But if mum and dad are stressed out their brain and are negative about much of life, and a kid's teacher is tired and spends the whole day doing behavior management, and the police officer, looks like a paramilitary, where's the kid getting a different message from? So this is a society-wide problem about our current state of how we live and how we perceive our lives, that it's probably going to be hundreds of little things to address it, because there's never just one way. We do podcasts for a similar reason, because we live in an amazing place and we want people to know it, and there's amazing things to know and we want them to know them. That seems to me as powerful a thing to improve conversations and people's ability to listen as 2 guys with microphones can do. And of course, the messaging thing. Like, you're a marketing guy. I'm seriously thinking next year of starting a master's in strategic communications, because I'm sick of communications in so many critical areas being so bad. Like, I need another qualification like I need a hole in the head. But I'll probably do it anyway, because it needs to be done better. And if I can do it better, it needs to be done better.
Well, I want to talk to you about that, because we might need good people on our team.
Well, we might have to be a team.
Yes. Well, it's the sort of thing that it is. I guess in a situation like this, we reflect on what is it that we can do in our little patch of turf to make the little bit of difference we can amid our own stress and pressure. And, that's where the ball's fallen for me. So, yep, I'd raise to that ruddy cry to do the bit that we can do. And meanwhile, feel a little bit okay about not getting swept into those voids of Facebook conversations. I will say, when I floated that this topic was coming up on Facebook, one of that particular piece has been almost 24 hours now.
Well, again, I've looked at it every couple of hours and gone, wow, it's still going.
Yeah, and I haven't. I just haven't. My soul would be crushed.
Yeah.
At the venom. It is ultimately poisonous. But from what you've said, is this a way people are finding an outlet? They're so frustrated, they hit out to release some pressure, even though all it really does is pass that pressure on to other people.
Yep, and then the ripple just goes around and wipes out more people, so they respond in the same way.
Dear listener, we always try to have a positive basis to what we do, constructive more so than just positive in a confection way. I think we've kicked up enough things to hold on to with some degree of positivity. But yes, there is a point of a little bit of frustration and being a bit spent at the moment. But we will do what humans have done since humans have been on here. We will take stock, we'll breathe deeply, and we'll reset things and move forward. Any final thoughts, David, before we drift into the night?
Really, just to reiterate what you just said, listeners, if you want to write something on Facebook or Twitter that's mean or aggressive or is going to cause conflict, take a few deep breaths and go, what's it going to add to the world? What's it going to add to you? There's a wonderful line in Sanskrit, and I can't remember the Sanskrit, but it translates as, are my thoughts useful? How do they behave? And I've always found those 8 words very powerful. Are my thoughts useful? How do they behave? So if your thought isn't useful and the behavior that will come from it is aggressive or negative or disruptive, doesn't add value to the world, stop there.
And that would actually make you feel good.
Stopping's great.
Yes.
It's much better than doing something you can't take back.
And I did it tonight. There was a story about a South Australian businessman who was trading insolvent and, I've paid the price for being linked to someone who did that, and I was about to share something. And you know what? I wrote it and then I deleted it. I thought, the world doesn't need that. And
you don't need to be the person that put it out there and then reflecting, why did I do that tomorrow?
Yeah. So we all are on a journey. We do the best we can. And now we've got police to protect us at an even higher level, David.
Hopefully they cope okay with doing the job.
Yeah.
And we make it possible for them to do the job that, again, they didn't sign up for that job when they first became police officers. This is a change that they have to adapt to, just like we have to adapt to it.
Yep. All good. And I certainly rely on them whenever that nasty edge of life comes our way. So always great respect. And yes, political leaders perhaps let the ball drop on this one in a fundamentally damaging way, but hopefully we'll recover. David Olney, who is heard frequently on Blind Insights with David Olney. There, I got your second plug in. It's a podcast. I'd even be happy if you stopped listening to Adelaide Show and just took up David's podcast. That's how important his topics are. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Bonjour, je m'appelle Guy Detot, vous êtes à Montgambier et vous écoutez le Adelaide Show.
Just before we finish this exploration and reflection on SA Police's SRS unit that's been talked about, you would have heard at the beginning of this program how I tasted some wine at 8 at the Gate Wines with Jane and Claire, and I'm here still. The sun has sunk even further since earlier when we did the recording, and around the bonfire, in fact just a little bit away from the bonfire, I have bumped into Vic Sukaz.
Yes. Victor Sukaz.
That's fantastic. Now, when I heard that, with the spelling, it sounded Hungarian. I lived in Budapest for a little while, but it's not Hungarian, is it? What's the origin of that surname?
My parents were from Ukraine.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now, why are you here, if that's not too personal a question, given that I'm the visitor?
No, well, I used to be married to Jane many years ago, and of course we've remained friends over time, and so at school holidays my kids go to school with her kids from a different husband, so we've just come here to help out.
That's great. And also the other thing, we're talking about roots down here in South Australia, but not like that, listener, is... you used to be involved with SA Police a long time ago, yes?
Yes, I was. I was a police officer here in South Australia from 1985 till 1990, and then I moved up to the Northern Territory up until 1995.
Okay, well, now, and the reason I wanted to have a quick chat with you now is because you're involved with United Nations around the world. But just before we leave the SA Police background, I was telling you before, I went out on patrol one night with a senior sergeant based at Mount Barker in the late 80s. It could have been around 1990. And on that Saturday patrol, pretty routine for him, I was scared out of my wits at least 3 times. One of them I remember, we were in the back blocks of the hills, and he saw a campfire deep off the road. He went down this one little windy track that there was no way to get out of quickly, and as relaxed as anything. He opens the doors, he says, "Here, you can hop out." And off we walked. "How are you? What are you up to?" And I was just expecting everything to go wrong, and that's the end of my life. But I was telling you, and is there something different in the way that you're either geared or trained to not panic at that moment? Because I would have just let them do what they were doing.
Oh, I think so. I mean, you do a lot of training to deal with dangerous situations, and over time, I guess, with experience, you do face a lot of violent people, or you're in dangerous or strange or threatening situations. And often when you come home and your partner or parents say, well, what did you do yesterday? And you say, well, I did X or Y. They all look shocked. And you go, oh, it's normal. So, yeah, I guess you do. And police officers, I'm sure, still do the same. They face a lot of challenging situations, which for them, they're well trained to handle.
Now, here's the thing, and I'm just trying to think what it's called. There's a particular beautiful bit of theory from the world of academia. It's where you don't know much, you think you know everything, and you then go deeper into something and you realise how little you know. I left that night. I felt 7 feet tall, having survived that shift. Is there a certain uprightness that comes from when you live in that day by day, or does that wear off?
That's a really good question, actually, and I think you have moments that when the day is over, you think, oh, that was a major. We've achieved something that day, and you are proud, and you actually have worked hard. And there are some times when you think, whoa, that was scary, but I've survived, and that was good, and that was challenging and stressful. But absolutely, yeah, you do get moments like that you can do something. But as you know in life, things always keep you grounded.
Yes.
The reality of things, yeah.
And I just remember Dunning-Kruger. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect. That's what that's called. Okay. Now, the reason I wanted to just have a chat with you, and already David Olney has put me a lot more at ease with the SRS. I understand how it integrates as part of an overall unit. But because we're about to see some of SAPOL officers with full Kevlar and the semi-automatic weapons, etc., and just getting a head around it, when you're on patrol, like, you've been out in the field in different places in that sort of setup. What's going through your mind? What is the experience like at that pointy end where perhaps the stakes are a little bit higher than we might expect here in Adelaide or SA?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I work in Kabul now, so when you are moving from A to B, you're pretty much always on alert. Now, I work in Kabul now, so when we are moving from A to B, you are watching everybody, every metre. We have armoured vehicles. You may or may not have an escort with you, with armed policemen with assault rifles. You're driving along a road that's frequently an area where attacks have occurred. So it's stressful, it's a bit scary. You don't want to be complacent, although a lot of people, you can slip into that. So, yeah, it's not like driving from A to B in other countries. Say, if you're working in Adelaide or South Australia, A to B is okay. But where I work, it's very, very different. Yeah, you need to be on the ball and sort of keep your head. But you need to pay attention to where you're going.
Look, it's quite possible that Afghanistan and Adelaide only have the letter A in common at the beginning of their names. But that thing about complacency is fascinating, and that alertness. Because early this morning I was in Narracourt. I was walking along near a little area where there was bird life, and I heard birds tweeting in the tree, and this weird thought struck me, is that I just hear it and I keep walking because it's a bird. I'm under zero threat. But had I been a little critter that birds eat, even snakes, we learned in an earlier episode, snakes know that they're a perfect dinner for birds, so they're actually going to be nervous. This is the sort of conditioning that the people you work with must be attuned to filter in and out sound. So we see in Hollywood you go through special training to spot little things. Is that an always-on, adrenaline-pumping kind of experience? Well, we would go from A to B without a moment's thought. Just how active is the brain during that time, or is it really just drilled training looking for certain symptoms?
I think it's, there's probably two ends of the scale. There's too complacent and there's highly alert, and it's probably depends on each person is different. Whereas, me, I have a security background, so when I leave my compound to go for work in another area, I'm usually pretty switched on. I'm pretty risk averse. I don't want anything to go wrong. I'm sure that there are staff who will jump in a car. They're being conveyed from A to B. They might be happy to be on their phone, texting away. But really, we never advise something like that. We always have a very basic message to people. They don't have to have this adrenaline rush, but they just should be alert and aware. It's a very simple level of alert and awareness that you probably won't need. I will drive home from here with my kids. We can enjoy the scenery, but we don't have to worry about noises and what's that guy doing walking towards the car and all that kind of stuff. So alert and awareness, and I think it's not necessarily you are not on the top of your sort of adrenaline sports rush, but you are paying attention.
Yeah, because survival is getting that balance right, I imagine. And do you see the ripple effect of people seeing you and them reacting? Because I imagine I'm going to stiffen a little bit if I suddenly see our version of a gendarme.
I think, we drive around in white cars, so everyone kind of looks at us anyway. But when I'm looking, if you make eye contact with someone, there is a difference. And that's one thing I do. I like to make eye contact. If there's a person walking, it takes you less than a split second to realise that's just a normal person going about their business. But you never know. One day you could meet someone that may want to hurt you, so then you can tell your driver, or you can take some action, or you can avoid it. So we're very much into avoid trouble. So hence we stay alert, avoid trouble where possible.
And I'm just curious, is the thing that you react to the abnormal? So there's a normal set of reactions you'd expect to see, but it's the abnormal one? Or are there specific things you're trained to look for that are signals that there's ill intent at heart?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, because what's normal or what's abnormal? And you just look at everything and you take your environment in when you're moving around. And we may just be going somewhere, so the trip is not our mission per se, but the fact is that we're moving somewhere. But still, once you leave your compound, even before you leave your compound, everything's got to be ready. You need to be able to communicate with the right people. Everything's got to be right. Everything's got to be ready. And then once you're outside, and there's lots of people outside, normal people, everyone's outside. So you're just one of the crowd. And I think there's nothing that is abnormal. And of course, if someone wants to hurt you, perhaps they've prepared themselves, or they understand your movement, or they know what to do, or they know how to approach you. So you just have to pay attention. And we always tell people, if you feel that something's wrong, you're probably right. So change your direction, go back to base, stop, call, or whatever.
And the last question before, I just want to finish off with something more general, and that is there in the mix of how to be, especially in the pointy end, when you're in the UN and you're right there, you're right in where we need you to be, is there a degree of fatalism that needs to be part of the mix as you go out and about? I just try to get my head around it. We all know that we're all finite. We all finish at some point. But most of us live in this lovely cocoon of safety. And you're mixing it where, you are right at the edge of where the stats might be. Is there a philosophical mix that I suppose is going to be separate, individual for each person?
I guess there is, and if people aren't comfortable with the risk there, they won't be there. So everyone that there is comfortable with accepting some kind of risk personally. I'm sure, I don't want to comment too much on what the organisation does in relation to risk, but the organisation does accept some risk, but it's calculated and it's very careful, and there's no sort of flippant attitude towards it. But we don't forget a part of it is we have normal lives too. We are also day 9 to 5 workers doing a job. but there is an element of risk that the staff are exposed to. They're well trained, they're well briefed, everything's explained to them. It's not just you go there, you'll be right. It's this is the risk. This is what you're going to do to mitigate that risk. This is how you're going to. We're going to enable your work in the safest way possible, but there is some risk. And if staff don't want to accept that, well, then they're just not going to be there.
No. And so, just to finish in a more general, as a human, you're here, you have progeny, you have lovely kids. I've got to meet them today. They're beautiful futures. You are in the place where you see where the world has some pointy bits. I mentioned to you earlier today that I worry that in this environment with the way the media is these days, there's a lot of easy fake news, undermining the trust we have in our institutions. The UN is a great institution and it gets undermined. So is science. So are many things that are undermined. Are there any thoughts that can give us some succour, some hope, some optimism amid the bleakness that you need to be alert to?
Well, that's a really good one. That's a curly question. I mean, I've worked in Lebanon, Macedonia, Sudan, Afghanistan, East Timor, and really the people are just people like everywhere else. And unfortunately, Afghanistan, Lebanon, the people that suffer are the people, the Afghan people, the Lebanese people, and these are the mums and dads and the kids just trying to have a normal life, and there's a lot going around them. Organisations like the UN are there trying to help. The UN has many, many faces, as we know, and it's not easy, but most of my colleagues are local colleagues from the place that we work at. Most of my colleagues in Afghanistan are Afghan people. We're trying to help and support them with our knowledge as best we can. In terms of hope, I don't know. I'm sure human nature in the end will prevail, and a lot goes to play. Things happen in this world, but there's a lot at play behind the scenes. That's kind of a political discussion. I think it's too long now.
Well, Steven Pinker, I think it was, a very well-respected philosopher. I'm pretty sure it was him. He did some analysis of the history of violence in the world, and we are living in the safest time in human history ever. It seems counterintuitive to some of us, and certainly if you watch Fox News, it would be counterintuitive. Is it counterintuitive to you? Because you work in data, so you probably have a more binary view of the world than the rest of us.
Yeah, I mean, you can get statistics to tell you whatever you want. And often I've said to my colleagues, I said, well, look, this may or may not be as bad as it was 10 years ago. What's the same? What's changed? And there's a lot of questions asked. There's more females being educated, the government is functioning better, the government's making more revenue. You can look for signs of improvement, you will find them. You can look for signs of things deteriorating, you will find them. Is the glass half empty or is the glass half full? Governments change, policies change, the wheels of life continue. And I think that that's a question with no answer, I think. Really.
And on that note, can I say at the beginning of this, our Aid of the Great Wine's glass was half full. Now it's half empty. We better get back to the crew. Vic, thank you so much.
No, you're most welcome.
And now it's time for the musical pilgrimage.
Time for the musical pilgrimage to continue now, and we will continue with the theme of policing for this particular track. It's a track entitled Unlock the System by Jay Miller, and this young man who has grown up in Darwin, spends a lot of time in Adelaide now, was written in his response to Aboriginal deaths in custody. In particular, it was a response to hearing of news about a young man who'd been shot dead by a police officer in remote Northern Territory. as Jay Miller says, I watched the men in my family go in and out of jail all my life. It wasn't so much a question of why is Dad going to jail. It was more like what's going to happen to my dad or my brother while he's in there. So we're going to have a listen to this track now. As you know, I have broad musical tastes, but I struggle in describing some forms of music. So I'm going to take a little leaf out of some of the writing about Jay Miller to explain that this is a rap track with spoken word, Wu-Tang, club rap and Aussie rap vibes. And it also features alternative beats with R&B elements. In essence, it's a story about Black Lives Matter. It's also worth noting that Jay Miller's got quite a following online. On TikTok, his account has 120,000 followers, with posts that boast 3+ million views. He's got 15,500 followers on Instagram, almost 20,000 on Facebook, and a music video for his 2018 track, My People, recently passed 100,000 views on YouTube. That's quite some pedigree when it comes to social capital and tapping the pulse of the zeitgeist in his career. And many thanks also to Todd Fisher for alerting us to the existence of this track, just perfect for this particular episode. So let's have a listen now. Unlock the System, Jay Miller.
I just wanna know what is peace. Can someone educate us all? Because all that it seems is that no one even knows what it means. I mean, I could be wrong, but society is telling me that freedom isn't actually free. I hate to say, but it's hard being black in these streets, and when we tell them, they don't wanna believe. Cause we're locked up in a system that we can't even see. Well, I guess my last song went right over your heads, cause I was sending out a message, but the message wasn't read. Reconciliation is what we all gotta spread. So what more needs to be said for this to get in your head? It's like, if you're white, you're right. But if you're black in this country, it's an everyday fight. But for real, I just wanna know why. It's like the system that we in is going back in the time. I'm sick and tired of the pain going on in the streets. We tryna make a change, but they won't let us speak. There's innocent black people who were murdered by police and no one's given a. Well, that's the way it all seems. That there's a whole lot of things that we never discuss. The media never reveals what really happens to us. But when a wombat was killed, man, they made it a fuss. But let a cop shoot a brother, they never did lock him up. How would you feel if you had a stereotype? How would you feel if the police pulled you up at night? How would you feel being judged in your everyday life? How would you feel? Nah, stuff that. How would you feel if a cop ran straight through your house and shot your son in the head and left him dying by the couch? Dragged his body outside as he was crying out loud and left your family tortured as they all surround. And now I just wanna see a change. We protest in our country to stop all the pain, but negativity still comes our way. We need to unlock the system, cause right now it's not safe, but I really do take in hand. There's a lot of white mob on this land to do as much as they can to give back, and yes, I understand. That's why I love my white folks, cause they do give a damn. Now listen, we need to look out for each other, but even better, we spread love for one another. Cause there be some days on my mind I really wonder how we gonna make a change for the way they see our color. Cause some nights I can't sleep, I just wanna make it so us indigenous people can eat. So I preach, like every day of the week, so hopefully sometime we can live our life in peace. And that's real, that's real. I say, like every day of the week, so hopefully sometime we can live our life in peace. I say, that's real. That's real. So I preach, like every day of the week, so hopefully sometime we can live our life in peace. Oh no.
Jay Miller and Unlock the System. And that brings us to the end of episode 310 of the Adelaide Show podcast. Thanks for listening. There'll be, of course, more interviews with more passionate South Aussies coming soon. Don't hesitate to let us know if there are people you come across who are worthy of sitting down for an hour or so and having a deep dive into their world. Until next time, it's good night from me, Steve Davis. Good night, Don.
The Adelaide Show podcast is produced by my dad, Steve Davis. If you want to start a podcast or get some help producing creative content, talk to him. Visit stevedavis.com.au. Thanks, AJ. I'm Caitlin Davis, and I agree with everything my sister said. But there's one more thing to say. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a rating or a review, because that will make my dad really happy. Oh, and one more thing. If you really, really liked it, please help a friend put the Adelaide Show on their phone. Thanks for listening. Buzz, buzz, I want to be. Adelaide, 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 ooh, Adelaide, 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 ooh.